super excited to welcome Robert Leshner, founder and CEO of Compound. We're going to do an AMA segment here, and we sourced a lot of questions from the broader global and Compound ecosystem. So I'll just go rapid fire into this, and hopefully we have enough to talk about for 30 to 40 minutes. If not, we'll talk about whatever Robert wants to talk about. So we'll start with something easy. Robert, I've known you for a few years. We've seen so much happen in DeFi. My first question is, 3 years ago, when you originally thought Compound would be and what it is now, is that exactly what you thought in a good way? What is like the expectation versus reality? Could you do sort of a comparison and contrast how that world was then and now?
Yeah, so first off, I'm excited to be here speaking with you all today. 3 years ago, when we launched Compound, it was, August 2018, I think is when the first version of Compound was launched. It was after a year of building. In solitude, in the upstairs attic above an advertising agency. And we didn't know what to expect. There was very few things that looked or worked like DeFi applications at this time. The phrase DeFi would sort of like be invented like around the same time that Compound launched, not by Compound, but by other folks in the community. It was a very early time. And what we were telling ourselves at the time was that it would take potentially 5 to 10 years before there would be any meaningful traction in DeFi. At the time, there were some very early experiments in DEXs, from, Token Trader to Ether Delta to 0x, later to Uniswap. But at the time, there was just like these very primitive examples of people trying to use smart contracts to create, financial tools that sort of just ran on their own, right? And so our genuine expectation was it was going to be 5 to 10 years. One, because it would take 5 to 10 years for assets from the real world to start to come into crypto, besides just like crypto natively issued tokens. We thought that the user experience was extremely clunky, and version 1 of Compound was so hilariously clunky, and we just thought it would take forever. And I think things evolved a lot faster than we expected. The white paper for Compound at the time was like, here's this system. And eventually, eventually to us, actually, we thought it was 5 to 10 years. Eventually, it will be run by a DAO, because even then, the term for anything like, smart contract managed was DAO, right? And we said, eventually this will be run by a DAO. We thought it was going to be years. The pace at which things unfolded was actually much faster than I or anybody in the community or anybody outside of crypto, or really anyone inside of crypto. And that includes like the most passionate believers. It all occurred faster than anyone would have anticipated. By the end of 2018, Compound had like $20 million of assets in it. It was like number 2 behind MakerDAO, which I think there was like $50 million of assets in MakerDAO at the time. I mean, 2019, I think, was actually a really big year for DeFi, because really of the growth and, adoption of stablecoins. Stablecoins really weren't that popular in 2018. There were some very early examples of them, but 2019 saw, Tether on Ethereum. It saw USD coin. It saw the growth of DAI. It was still called Psi at the time, and all of these stablecoins. And this was like this sort of missing ingredient that turbocharged DeFi in my mind. Suddenly, applications like Compound started to make a lot of sense to people. No one really wanted to borrow Ether. They really wanted to borrow stablecoins. People didn't necessarily want to trade an arbitrary token. They wanted to trade, a stablecoin for crypto, or trade a crypto for stablecoins, and just enable the whole ecosystem to grow rapidly. And so everything started moving at a speed faster than we anticipated. And that actually encouraged us to take what we thought was going to be a 5-year journey and condense its time frame and move the governance of Compound to a DAO, or the community, and decentralize the protocol. And I actually think, the thing that eclipsed our thinking was, how fast we would be able to hand over controls. A lot of the steps that went into this process, Compound created or designed, and are now becoming like the staples of, DeFi, but like, having a time lock contract. We wrote a time lock that's now like, used in hundreds of projects. We wrote a governance system and, voting token, which are used in hundreds of projects. And, all these things we had to discover for ourselves and just continuously try to, not just innovate on the core protocol, but the tools by which, the community could use to run the protocol. And so, I didn't think by this point we would have a decentralized protocol. When we launched Compound, it was running on admin keys. And now it's pretty much anything but. It's a community run and decentralized protocol. And it happened a lot faster than I would have guessed.
Oh, this is incredible. Unknowingly, you've set the stage for all the other questions I had because you touched on every single topic I have a big question on. So we'll go deeper into everything. So no, this is incredible. I think it still blows my mind that I remember last February, or actually, early February, I was like, wait, DeFi just crossed $1 billion in TVL, and that feels like forever, but it was not even 18 months ago. and
yeah, the space moves so fast.
Just we couldn't imagine when Maker crossed 100 million in ETH deposits, and it's still not 2 years ago, I think. But it's great. You already set the stage here, so I think one of the super interesting things here is that you essentially were one of the super cutting edge, but also high profile projects to introduce things like liquidity mining and governance and just all these growth tactics. In my opinion, it's a little bit challenging because you are the first ones to do this thing and find out if it's working or not. So you're just in a super interesting position, which is good and bad at the same time. But kind of knowing everything now in hindsight, anywhere from new things we've invented to learnings from trying all those things out in iterations. If you were to launch Compound again now, what would you do something differently?
I would do a lot differently. A lot of things that we did at the time were being done for the first time. We had to make some educated guesses. And even in the educated guesses, it was impossible to predict whether we were going to be right, wrong, too conservative, too aggressive, or what. The idea of, handing over the protocol to the community without like a gatekeeper was considered like an absolutely radical idea. At the time, there was a few other examples of decentralized governance, but they were very early still. MakerDAO was a good example. But people thought it was crazy that, there wasn't going to be a foundation, directly managing a protocol. A lot of the investors in Compound Labs thought it was crazy that we would give away half the tokens. Up until this point, there was really no project that was giving away tokens at all. They were selling tokens, right? Everyone thought that 50% of the tokens being given away was like an insane thing. The mechanics by which we decided to actually roll out governance was also extremely experimental. People forget, but Compound governance and the voting contracts and the voting system was actually tested live for 3 months with like a limited token holder group before being rolled out to the entire community, which is something that I actually haven't seen since. People go from zero to full on-chain governance, sometimes. Oftentimes the intermediate steps are like there's snapshots or there's, a team that's vaguely in control and enforcing the community's will. But, we basically went from, centralized to decentralized, but the intermediate step was not like some intermediate governance solution. It was just allowing a limited stakeholder group to use the full, on-chain tools.
Hacky staging environment.
Exactly. If we could do it all differently, there's a couple things that have emerged as like standards in the communities, not just of Compound, but in crypto and in DeFi generally, that I think we would have adopted, but they just didn't really exist yet. So one is, I would say, distributing tokens to historical users. When we started distributing tokens to users, it was to all present and future users. It wasn't historical looking. I actually think the way Uniswap handled it was phenomenal. It's probably too late to go back and revise this, but if I could go back to the beginning of 2020, we would have changed how we allocated tokens between future users and present users and historical users. That's the first thing that I think would have changed. The second is that I think there should, if I could do it all over again, I think there should have been, generally more for developers. It's, very easy to focus on users, but I actually think the most important part of the protocol in a lot of ways are developers. And I think that coming up with some method of allocating tokens specifically for projects built on top of Compound or developers building on top of Compound would have been really valuable. It's also, hard to go back and change that, but I actually think the community can potentially start to like recalibrate and focus more on, the developer side of things as opposed to just raw users of the protocol itself.
So is this nuance from are you sort of differentiating another category between like a grants program equivalent, or kind of what do you mean by that?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think the way it gets developed and expresses itself, now is something like a grants program, right, where you can allocate to developers. But I also think in terms of, allocating, tokens and governance rights to just applications, I think it'd be more interesting, to look at not just how do you distribute governance to, stakeholders that are building, but also applications built on top of the protocol. At the end of the day, what we wanted and didn't see play out as closely as, I would have hoped would have been, tokens going to like custodians and like things like that are directly integrating the protocol. If I could revise it, I think we would have changed, the actual logic a little bit, but building a system for the first time is incredibly difficult and it's hard to plan for all of these outcomes. And I think what we also could have done is, if I could go back in time, it would have been, setting up things like, a grants committee sooner, as opposed to letting it sort of like slowly develop over time. Again, when we created, Comp and when we distributed it to users, these weren't really concepts yet. But now these are concepts, so if I could go back in time, to the day that Comp was released, I think we would have, had in place, some allocation of tokens overseen by the community, not through the protocol and the user, usage of it, but like to be distributed by users to other builders, to other participants, to other stakeholders.
Absolutely. I think if I'm parsing this right, like I think a lot of this is about tightening the feedback loops, the way I see it, because you get to understand and iterate much faster. And I think that's an excellent sort of framing as well. On something you just mentioned, obviously being the first one to try things out is challenging, but what did you kind of think would happen for liquidity mining when you introduced it, and anyone from concerns to what you would change now, and specifically around that?
Yeah, it's funny because at the time, it wasn't really called liquidity mining, and internally, like we didn't think of it like as like liquidity mining. We just thought of it as, hey, this is like the coolest thing we can do to like bring users into the fold, right? And we thought, well, the product is great. What if we make it even greater by like, giving Comp to all the users? Like people love Compound today, they'll extra love Compound,
Yeah.
if we just give them the tokens. And we didn't really know what was going to happen. There was a couple other, similar approaches that other, ecosystem participants had done in the past. I thought, as we were designing it, we had been able to observe synthetics and some of the approaches they were taking. So, people say Compound invented liquidity mining. I don't really agree. But I do think, we came up with a way of distributing liquid tokens to users for using the protocol directly, as opposed to incentivizing some liquidity pool, right? Or like some, Uniswap pool or whatever, right? We also saw exchanges that have been doing, there was a long time ago, there was a concept called trans fee mining that was like popular for like 3 months before like the exchanges that like pioneered it like imploded horribly. But like, what they did is they would give tokens to users based on how much trading volume they had. And this was actually bad because it led to a lot of like wash trading and like just like useless activity. And what we wanted to avoid was people like, entering into useless activity. And we tried to design a system that would just reward users, not like arbitrary things. And it was hard to get it exactly right. I think, if anyone on this call remembers the first couple of weeks of the Comp distribution, the first couple of weeks were chaotic because it was like first of its kind. Changes to it had to go through governance, which was like a little bit slow. And the incentives were crazy. So like certain markets wound up being like hilariously used when like they didn't serve as much of like a legitimate underlying economic purpose as people expected. Like the bat market, if anyone remembers, was like the #1 market on Compound. And everybody like on the internet and Twitter was like, why is bat so large? And it's just because the algorithm that was used, just led in this like unexpected consequence to like BAT being the #1 market in Compound. And people are scrambling to like find BAT, take it off exchanges, move it into Compound. It was like such a bizarre situation.
Yeah. Oh, I remember all those things. Yep, it was chaotic. One last kind of question on this. You sort of mentioned that a lot of people started using a lot of the things that you came up with as part of um, the launch, and anywhere from contracts on how to manage governance to just liquidity mining stuff. Was it sort of did you take that as like a super good thing when everybody started using it? You have hundreds of projects, or was that worrying? How do you connect? Look at
Yeah, I
that.
take it as a super good thing. Like one of the best virtues of, Ethereum and DeFi on Ethereum, and this applies to other blockchains as well, but one of the strongest virtues I find is that, you know, every project increases the network effect of the entire ecosystem. And, if Compound can build a contract that other people can use, great, right? If projects don't have to reinvent the wheel and they can use like the Compound time lock code or like the comp token code or the comp governance system code, great. It means there's more things happening on Ethereum for everybody, and everyone's going to benefit from it, whether it's Compound directly or Compound indirectly. Like the more people that are able to ship things faster, it just benefits the entire ecosystem. When we started, there was almost no code that we could use off the shelf, right? There was almost nothing that we could like refer to in terms of like how to like build out an application like Compound. We had to like truly discover and innovate a lot of the most basic, concepts. Like Compound pioneered peer to like pool liquidity. Like this didn't like really exist yet.
On-chain interest rates, like
Yeah, and like how to like compute interest rates for an infinite quantity of users with one computation instead of iterating over a list of them. Like very basic things we had to like discover for ourselves. And now, like if we wanted to write Compound or we wanted to like make a new version, like it wouldn't take the year that it took the first time, right? It's not that like we got smarter, it's that there's more things available now. Like you don't have to like roll your own everything. You can like focus on building a core application and like, use certain contracts off the shelf or in lightly modified ways. And so the fact that like people don't have to build out their own governance tools, I think is unbelievably valuable for everyone because you get like a more decentralized ecosystem. The fact that people don't have to like, do the R&D to like discover basic concepts and they can just copy pieces from Compound is great, right? So I think in a lot of ways, whether it's noticed or unnoticed, the more people that are using, pieces of the Compound ecosystem, it's like, a silent victory. And I think the people that do notice, it's even better.
Would you then say that it's usually not a good thing to be a first mover in this space because you don't have to figure a lot of this out? Or
it's definitely harder to be a first mover. And what's really funny is when we were designing the Compound governance system, like the way that the token works, the way you can delegate votes, the way you actually vote on proposals, like the way the system like mechanically operates. When we were designing it, we always say like we have a second mover advantage. Because like discovering it for the first time would be like so hard. We got to like look at MakerDAO. We got to look at like, like other things that have been built. We had to, we had an opportunity to look at like Tezos, the blockchain, and how they were doing like governance of their blockchain. Like we had a second mover advantage, and I think it allowed us to spend less time building a better system. If we had to discover all this stuff for the first time and we had nothing to compare it to, it would have been really, really, really hard. And so like I give a lot of kudos to the teams that had to be the first mover on even designing governance.
Absolutely. Let's see. So I think a lot of projects right now are very focused on getting more and more people involved as they think about anywhere from increasing their users to their community. How did you initially bootstrap the Compound ecosystem in the community, and what advice would you give right now to projects that are trying to spar a community?
Yeah, so I think there's things that we did well. I think there's things we didn't do phenomenally well. I think the first thing that's actually important is the ability to delegate votes was built natively into the comp token and the governance system. I actually think this is really important because sometimes the most active participants and the loudest voices aren't the wealthiest users, right? And like what you want is a system where just anyone who's like active and wants to contribute has the opportunity to have like a loud say in the direction of the protocol, even if they're like new or young or entering crypto for the first time, right? Like it leads to more of a meritocracy. So I think, the way we built the comp token and the delegation system was actually like a really strong tool to get like a couple like really active participants involved in the community. The things that we didn't do well is it's now been like over a year, a little more than a year since comp was released. And like, I feel like it's taken a long time for the community to start to organize around having a grants committee, having a process to like directly reward contributors. Like we weren't able to foresee the importance of that. And, it led to there being like a delay before I think a lot of people could like start to get involved. And compound governance is starting to like very rapidly evolve and flourish. And I think we're starting to see more and more participants coming in. And, I think that, one of the things that we could have done better originally, and I think that other projects can learn from, is just having like a solid, foundation to be able to talk to contributors, reward them, make them a part of the process. And it didn't start off with that.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think the second falls into the first one to figure this out, so others then can copy and be like, oh, we should change this thing when we do it ourselves. Changing gears a little bit, last week, an exploit was discovered on Compound. Could you tell us kind of what happened and sort of how do you kind of think about making sure that this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, so this goes to what I think is like truly the biggest opportunity of an open and decentralized protocol, and also the biggest risk. But like I'd like to start with the biggest opportunity. So the biggest opportunity is that anyone can become a core contributor to the Compound protocol. There's no obstacles, there's no roadblocks. Anyone listening right now can become a core contributor. You don't have to be a member of Compound Labs. And it's an open development process with a group of community members that's excited to welcome new developers into the process. And it means that people can work on code at the heart of Compound. And so, there was a bug that came from an amazing, contribution from a great contributor who was looking to upgrade one of the features of Compound. This upgrade was reviewed by lots of the community members. It was reviewed by members of Compound Labs. It was like what I actually think of as one of like the most virtuous benefits of decentralization is that you could have a community member being a core contributor, adding and improving like core functionality of the protocol, making it better. The biggest risk is that there is a bug, right? And in proposal 62, there was a bug. It happened, right? Luckily, there was no user funds that were lost. What was lost was comp that was reserved for future users. So in a lot of ways, it was like a bank error in the favor of, in some cases, like very randomly selected addresses. And, it was the first time that there was really like a smart contract bug that led to a loss of funds in Compound history. And this is a massive disappointment. Now, this one proposal 62, shows the opportunity and it shows the risk of distributed governance and distributed development. And it shows how distributed development is different than centralized development, where there's like one core team that like writes all the code and then people can vote on it. Like Compound goes all the way and it's decentralized development. And so there's nothing better than Prop 62 to sort of like embody this. I think it's going to be a catalyst for change within the community and within the decentralized development process, because I think it's going to lead to a little bit more conservatism in a good way, where there's going to be, more participants, more review, more analysis, and it's going to lead to a much stronger decentralized development process. But Compound's also one of the first projects that like really, develops in this fashion. Most projects, even when they have decentralized voting control, they have centralized development. There's obviously some incredible examples to learn from. Like Bitcoin, is, an open development process. Like anyone can become a contributor to it, right? And I think Compound is headed in that way, where you're going to have an open source code developed by a community, not a permission team,
Right.
right? And that's the direction it's heading. And I actually think that 62 is an amazing wake-up call because it was a disaster. I mean, frankly, like it's a disaster, right? It led to a loss so far of, about 220,000 comp is missing, right? But it didn't lose user funds, and no one in the community is going to forget this. It's going to change the way that development occurs. It's going to, I think, clarify the minds of all of the contributors. And I think long-term, it's going to lead to a lot of improvements in the protocol. There were bugs in Bitcoin, right? That's a fact, right? This was a bug in Compound, but if the community handles it correctly, it'll be the last bug in Compound.
No, I think that's a very optimistic and a good note. As a summary, I think this is super interesting. What I guess on the same theme, you are the CEO of Compound Labs, but a minority token holder of the Compound protocol. How do you kind of see your role in this ecosystem and for the protocol, and sort of what do you think that looks like compared to what the community expects of you as well?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because, I think there's more of a desire to have a figurehead than there should be, right? Like, I'm not actually special. Like, pretty much anyone listening to this call could play almost as large of a role in the Compound protocol that I play. What I have is years of, experience and, a history with the protocol and a passion for it. But I think in order for a protocol like Compound to succeed, like, it has to be taken up by the community. They have to take it over. Like, Satoshi's not here to guide Bitcoin, right? And I think Bitcoin is stronger because of it, right? If you had, a single figurehead that was like in charge, I think you get a worse outcome. And so, I think, I'm trying to make my role more and more of like a cheerleader and somebody who knows how the system works, but someone who like very genuinely wants the community to take over as much as possible.
Yeah, and I don't mean this in any negative or bad way, but it's just interesting to see when sometimes the crowd goes against what you're interested in if you're voting on something, and like that in a way is a true way of showcasing that this is working as expected.
Yeah, I've lost a couple votes like in Compound governance history, and that's great.
It's a great sign. Moving on to sort of looking at the growth of the ecosystem. If you were a developer and if somebody comes to you and says, I want to contribute to the Compound protocol, I guess, what do you think is important over the next couple of years for the way you think the community or the feature should go?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's really like 4 buckets of work that are needed in my mind. So one is, building out the core protocol itself, adding features, right? Adding like new code, adding modifications. We're starting to see a community, set of developers really start to like gain this as a skill set. Like a year ago, there was 1 or 2 developers that were like contributing to the core code. We're getting more and more contributors to the core code. And that's really exciting. And I think like we're starting to build a muscle as a community of like core contributors. The second are applications built on top of the protocol, right? There's huge opportunities for better interfaces, for taking the open source front end, forking it, improving it, adding new features, right? That I think are like underrepresented. One of the things we did a couple of weeks ago was open source and license the front end to the community and say like, hey, like take this, like go run it. Like there's a one-click deploy process to IPFS. Like, if you want to make a better version of this, like it should be what everyone uses, right? And I think like, the experimentation around the front end is like a little bit low, but I think there's really cool opportunities there. Like someone could build a front end that integrates Compound and Uniswap and does even cooler things with both of them. Or like, there's a lot of opportunity to make the core interface even better. And I think this is a little bit underserved.
Should that come from like people's own creativity, or do you think there's like a handful of things that you would like to see and you want to kind of incentivize that or broadcast that and tell people to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the creativity is the limit. Like I'm not able to think of all like the things that, a front end should be, but like I could see someone building a system that like, you can opt in to like sharing your email and like it sends you alerts when you're like borrowing capacity is getting too dangerous, and like, it could be more useful. You could see a version that like doesn't have that, but focuses more on like DEX integrations as well. Like there's a lot there that I think is possible. And so, I think front ends are like a really underdeveloped corner of this, because like there doesn't have to be one front end, right? Someone could, fix some bugs. Like Trezor and Ledger are always having issues as hardware wallets, using the interface. Like there's so much to do that can be improved upon. So that's the second. The third is that I actually think there's a big opportunity in the community to spend more time thinking about the sort of parameters of the protocol, right? Not like what is the code and how does it work, but like, what should the liquidation variables be? What should the collateral variables be, right? Why, right? Gauntlet has recently come in and started spending more time on this, but like there's big opportunities to think through the interest rate models and like the economic efficiency of these markets, things that are still run by humans, but that are like always looking for active contributors and thinkers. So if you're someone who's not technically inclined, but you are, economically or mathematically inclined, I think there's huge opportunities to like focus on the parameters of the protocol. And lastly, it's new projects. Like new projects are, this is a very vague and open-ended, category, but it's, could there be a version of the Compound protocol, specifically meant for being deployed to like rollups, right? Or that could work with like other things. Like, can the Compound community deploy the code elsewhere? Like, the sky's the limit, but I think like, there's a huge opportunity for creative thinking. And, for people to volunteer and say like, hey, it would be fun to have Compound on, Optimism, or Compound on Arbitrum, or Compound on Solana, or, whatever it is. And, basically like adapt the core code base and the open source front end to those networks. I think the grants, organization, should be able and excited to encourage this and to, incentivize, the success of this. And I think there's huge opportunities here. So, if you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself like, oh, it can't be that hard to like, deploy Compound on, Arbitrum, it's great, let's do it, right? Like as a community, like, anyone here can, help expand Compound. And I think that's really exciting and really empowering.
No, it is a great message. I mean, I do have a couple of things left, but they're all on the same theme before we kind of wrap today up. I think one of the most interesting things today, as we looked at all the talks, has been how much variety and sort of diversity there is on the types of projects that have been funded by the ecosystem. Some of them are just services that help you manage what your Compound positions are, to better interfaces, to more technical projects that help you improve the design and even parameter tweaking and managing risk. It is such a big ecosystem that you can contribute in so many different ways. And one common questions a common theme and common set of questions we've gone for every of these talks has been, how do I contribute if I'm not a developer? Or do I have to be really specifically like, I mean, perfect on understanding Solidity or one of the other skill sets? Is it really kind of how you're thinking about the growth of the ecosystem? Do you want to prioritize developers right now before you move on to other sort of types of skills, or what does that look like as you think about it from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would describe Compound as, very professional and boring anarchy. And, there's an opportunity for anyone with any skill set to come in and just start participating, right? Anyone could come in and just like, sort of like, there's no protocol job applications, so to speak, but if anyone's interested in like working like with a core DeFi protocol, there's a million opportunities for anyone with an idea on how they want to contribute. It's like, there's opportunities to help like come in as like a community like organizer and like, organize like the development processes, the community calls. There's roles for people to come in and spend more time on the economics of the protocol. There's opportunities for folks to focus on protocol business development, or focus on marketing, or focus on integrations. Like, whatever your skill set is, like if you just come into the community, you're really excited, you just raise your hand and you say, here's what I'm going to do. How do I do this? I think there's going to be a lot of support for it. And so there's very few people that tell you no, or that want to tell you no. there's not a lot of structure in a good way. I mean, it's decentralized protocol, but whatever your skill set, like there's probably something for you.
That's perfect. So hopefully the couple questions we got today, just right now, definitely address this. One sort of related, but a side conversation I want to have is, I think one interesting problem right now in this market is that the incentive to start something new is far greater than contributing to something existing. How do you think about balancing that, or do you have any advice for people on when they have this choice? What should they think about, long-term versus short-term, and anything around it?
Yeah, that's a great question. In a environment like this, systems like Compound that have been around for years, are incredibly exciting for certain reasons, but they're not as new as something that you can create from scratch. I think long term, simple, protocols like Compound are extremely important, but I understand the sort of like goals of like starting something from scratch. The advantages to working in a protocol like Compound are that, it's operating today. There's tens of billions of dollars in it. It's already at scale. There's a huge global user base, and you can have a huge impact in a way that you don't have to, take a risk on something that doesn't exist yet. But I'm someone who started Compound, from scratch, and so I understand the idea of entrepreneurship as well. But the skills that you build at Compound are also, the skills that are necessary to create a new protocol. And oftentimes I think, being a meaningful contributor to a protocol like Compound helps you on whatever journey you want to go on next. And so in a way you can have both.
Yeah, if anything, this could also be a way to sort of get experience understanding how to manage things at scale, and use that to learn and see what you can improve or change.
Exactly.
No, that's a really good way of thinking about it. Last question, and I feel like you've answered this in certain ways, but I want to get us a few more specific details here. For everybody that's kind of interested in contributing to Compound right now, what is kind of your wish list of things that are super interesting to you that you think the Compound ecosystem needs, and what is the process of becoming a contributor to the protocol?
Yeah, so to get involved, you can go to comp.xyz and join the Discord. That's where a lot of the conversations take place between those two. And you can ask what needs to be built, but like I think there's a lot of room to spend more time talking about things that haven't been looked at in years, like the interest rate models. Right? These are massively important, move billions of dollars, but like no one's really looked at like what the interest rate model should be in a really long time, right? So like taking a look at some of the parameters of the protocol with like a very like research-driven approach, I think is a good one. I think there's a large sort of like development wish list that you can find on compoundgrants.org, through RFPs and like projects that are in the works. If there's things that look interesting and like haven't been worked on, like great opportunity. I think, focusing on the, interface areas, like we just open sourced the interface, like I'll double back to this, there's a lot of opportunities to make the interface better. When we launched it in 2019, it was like the greatest interface that Web3 had ever seen, but that was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And the interface really has been pretty much the exact same since, and a lot has changed. I think, forking the interface and improving it is a huge opportunity. There's so many features that are available. And lastly, helping to expand, Compound to new markets and in new ways, I think is extremely exciting. It's much harder and longer work, especially because it comes from. What's that?
You mean for like a specific interface prioritizing a user group, or is that a product feature or protocol thing?
Yeah, in terms of like the protocol, like, working on, gateway, we're working on like, deploying the code base to like a roll up. Like there's a lot of opportunities to just expand, the access to the protocol. So that's the fourth area that I would say to look at, but it all starts with just like, raising your hand. There's a lot of people that are happy to talk to you. And I would say like comp.xyz and Discord are really great places to come.
Amazing. I think that's a perfect note to end on. And I think if there's two takeaways here, is go to comp.xyz and get involved with the community. And for those of you who are interested in building compoundgrants.org is the place to go to learn about how to get involved and get grants. Robert, thank you so much here. I want to thank everybody from the Compound team and the Compound Grants program. I'll do this plug one more time for all of you here. Compoundgrants.org is the place to be. You can see RFPs and apply for grants directly and get more and more involved. So with that, I want to thank everybody who tuned in today and participated. A lot of great questions, a lot of amazing projects, and a lot of links shared on how to get more pull requests on GitHub and get them to prod. So with that, I want to wish everybody a happy hacking for the rest of the hackathon. We got a few more days to go before all projects are due, and we can't wait to see what everybody builds next week. So until then, enjoy your weekend, everybody, or actually not yet. We're going to see all of you tomorrow for our Developer Tools Summit. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern. Take care.